The desert looked endless that morning, a furnace of shimmering heat where the horizon blurred like smoke. Ella Grayson pressed forward through the red sand, her once white blouse clinging to her back, her skirt ripped and heavy with dust. The soles of her boots had split open miles ago, and each step bit into her feet like broken glass. Her lips were cracked, her face burned raw, but she kept moving, driven by something stubborn and half-mad inside her. 3 weeks earlier, she had stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Creek, clutching her teaching certificate like a lifeline. The letter from the town council had promised a position, $30 a month, and a place to sleep. After losing both parents to sickness that winter in Boston, she had sold everything she owned to chase that promise. But Copper Creek had been a lie. The mine that fed the town was closed, the men gone, the saloon boarded up. Only a few weary families remained, scraping by on dust and regret. Jed Calloway, the storekeeper who served as acting mayor, had met her at the stage stop with an apologetic shrug. "Ma'am," he'd said, hat twisting in his hands, "we sent that offer before the mine went bust. Ain't no wages now, and not enough children left for a school." Those words had struck harder than the desert sun. She'd spent her last $15 getting there. Going back east was impossible. So, after 3 nights sleeping on the floor of an empty schoolhouse, she packed what little she had, a satchel of books, a locket, and $1.37, and set out on foot for Tombstone, 100 miles south. Folks said it was a bustling place, full of opportunity. By the second day, the desert stripped away all illusions of adventure. Her water jar grew lighter with every sip. By the third, she could feel the grit grinding between her teeth. She rationed the last biscuit into 4 small pieces and let them dissolve slowly on her tongue, pretending they were meals. At night, she wrapped herself in her shawl and listened to coyotes cry across the open land. Sometimes she prayed, sometimes she cursed. Mostly she tried not to think about Boston, the cool rain, the gas lamps, the safety of walls. By the 5th day, she could hardly remember her own name. Her skin felt tight and paper thin, her hands trembling from exhaustion. The landscape never changed, just rock, heat, and sky. Once she thought she saw water gleaming ahead and ran toward it, only to find dry clay and the bones of a cow bleached white by the sun. She sank to her knees, choking on dust and despair. This is how people disappear, she thought. They just stop walking. But even as her strength faded, pride kept her moving. She was a teacher, educated, proper, the daughter of a preacher. Dying out here felt like something unworthy of her father's memory. She took one more step, then another, until her legs gave out completely. The ground rose up to meet her, hot and merciless. She lay there on the red earth, cheek pressed against the grit, her heart fluttering weakly. The sky burned white above her. She thought about her mother's voice, reading psalms by lamplight. She thought about the children she'd never teach, the life she'd never have. Then the world began to fade, and that's when she heard it. At first it was faint, distant, just a rhythmic tremor beneath the wind. She lifted her head, squinting through the haze. The sound grew clearer, hooves striking hard earth, slow and steady. A rider. Fear gripped her before hope did. Out here, a lone man could mean salvation, or something far worse. She tried to crawl toward a nearby mesquite tree, but her body refused to move. The hoofbeats drew closer until she could see the shape. A man on a tall bay horse, hat low against the sun. She wanted to call out, but her throat was too dry for words. The rider slowed, then stopped a few yards away. Through the blur, she saw him dismount and kneel beside her. His shadow fell across her burning skin, cool as mercy. "Ma'am?" the voice asked, rough, deep, edged with concern. She forced her eyes open. The world tilted, and all she saw was a tanned face, kind eyes, and the brim of a worn hat. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're gonna be all right." She tried to speak, but the only word that came out was barely a whisper. "Water." The man reached for his canteen, lifted her head, and pressed the metal to her lips. Coolness touched her tongue. It was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. Before darkness claimed her again, she caught one last glimpse of him. Broad shoulders, sun-browned hands, and the glint of a silver buckle engraved with a single letter. M. And then the desert went still. She didn't yet know his name, Clay Mercer, or that meeting him would change her life forever. All she knew was that she had survived long enough to be found. The morning had started the way most did for Clay Mercer, with the crack of dawn spilling over the hills and the smell of sage and dust hanging in the air. He rode along the northern edge of his land, reins loose in one hand, his rifle slung easy across the saddle horn. The Circle M Ranch stretched farther than a man could see. 30,000 acres of cattle, fences, and the kind of quiet that only hard work earned. He'd built this empire with blistered hands and sleepless nights, starting from 100 acres of borrowed dirt and a promise to himself that he'd never be poor again. Now the herds moved like slow rivers across the plains. The corrals were full, and every man on the payroll answered to him. But success didn't buy peace. Not out here. The sun had climbed halfway up the sky when Clay spotted something strange against the landscape. A flicker of movement near the ridge where the red sand met the sky. At first he thought it was a coyote or a stray cow. Then he saw the shape stumble, collapse, and stay down. He pulled his field glass from the saddlebag. What he saw made him curse softly under his breath. A woman alone lying face down in the desert. Clay spurred his bay gelding, buckshot, and tore across the flats, dust billowing behind him. The closer he got, the worse it looked. Her dress was torn to ribbons, her bonnet gone, skin scorched from the sun. She wasn't moving. He slid from the saddle before the horse stopped moving, boots hitting the dirt hard. "Ma'am?" His voice came rough, carrying over the wind. "Can you hear me?" The woman stirred faintly, a broken sound escaping her lips. Clay knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her like a blanket. Her pulse fluttered against his calloused fingers, weak but there. Her skin was hot as a branding iron. He uncapped his canteen, lifted her head gently, and poured water over her cracked lips. She coughed, gasped, then drank like someone who hadn't tasted life in days. "Easy now," he murmured, steady and calm, the way he'd talk to a spooked colt. "You're safe. Just sip slow." When she opened her eyes, they were pale green, bright even through the fever haze. For a heartbeat, he forgot the heat, the cattle, the fences, everything. Those eyes were the look of someone who'd been to the edge of death and refused to bow. "Name's Clay Mercer," he said quietly. "You're on my land. What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" Her lips moved, the words barely audible. Ella Grayson." The name hit his chest like a memory he'd never had. There was refinement in it, a softness that didn't belong in a place built on sweat and gunpowder. "Well, Miss Grayson," he said, capping the canteen, "the desert nearly took you. Let's not give it a second try." He stood and whistled for buckshot. The gelding trotted over, muscles rippling under the sun. Clay slipped an arm around her, felt how light she was, nothing but bones and determination, and lifted her up like she weighed no more than a sack of grain. She tried to protest. "I can walk." He almost smiled. "You can barely breathe, ma'am. Let's get you to shade first." He found a mesquite tree a few yards off and carried her there, propping her against the trunk. The air was still hot as sin, but the shadow gave a little mercy. He tore a strip from his bandana, soaked it, and laid it across her forehead. Her eyelids fluttered. Why help me?" Clay looked out at the horizon, squinting against the glare. "Because if a man can ride past someone dying and not stop, he don't deserve to live much longer himself." She blinked at that, maybe trying to smile, but exhaustion won. Clay poured the last of his water into her mouth, then swung up into the saddle. "All right, Miss Grayson," he muttered, reaching down for her again. "You're coming home with me." He lifted her carefully, setting her across the saddle before him, her head resting weakly against his chest. Then he turned buckshot toward the distant ridge. The heat shimmered off the desert floor like ghosts. As they rode, Clay kept one hand steady on the reins and the other across her shoulders, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing. He'd seen men die in this country. Good men. But he wasn't about to let this woman join them. The desert stretched out endless before them, red and gold under the sun. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats echoed like a promise, steady, strong, alive. Neither of them spoke. But something passed between them anyway, something unspoken and raw as the land itself. By the time the rooftops of Circle M Ranch shimmered into view, Clay realized that this wasn't just a rescue. It was the start of a story neither of them could have written alone. The Circle M Ranch rose from the desert like a promise kept. Miles of weathered fences, a wide red-roofed house, and the steady rhythm of men working under the sun. When Clay Mercer rode through the front gate with the unconscious woman in his arms, the ranch hands stopped what they were doing. Dust swirled around the hooves of his horse as he dismounted, cradling her as though she were made of glass. Alma Reyes, the housekeeper, met him on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dios mío," she whispered, eyes wide. "She's all bones and blisters." "Found her out past the North Ridge," Clay said, his voice low. "Been walking too long. Get some water hot, Alma. I'll bring her in." Together, Alma and her husband, Mateo, the foreman, helped carry the stranger inside. The moment Ella's boots crossed the threshold, cool air and the scent of clean wood wrapped around her. The polished floors, the whitewashed walls, the faint ticking of a clock. Proof that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the wasteland she had crossed. They laid her on a cot near the kitchen stove, where the heat was steady. Alma peeled away the dust-stiffened fabric, murmuring in Spanish as she cleaned the burns on Ella's arms and the raw blisters on her feet. "You poor thing," she said softly. "The desert tried to take you, but God said no." From the back door came the gruff voice of Buck Travers, the ranch cook. "I got broth coming, thick as sin and twice as good." He poured it into a tin bowl, the smell of beef and herbs filling the room. Clay lingered by the doorway, hat in hand. He wasn't sure what made him stay. The sight of her face, pale but strong, or the quiet way Alma worked over her, humming an old Mexican hymn. When the bowl was empty and the fever had broken, Alma turned to him. "She'll live," she said, "but she needs rest, food, and time." Clay nodded, relief loosening his chest. "She'll get all three." When Ella Grayson woke again, the world was soft. Morning light poured through lace curtains, and somewhere nearby a rooster crowed. Her body ached, but her thirst was gone, her skin cool. She tried to sit up and froze when the door creaked open. Clay stood there, hat still in his hand, looking far more uncertain than he ever did in front of his men. "Ma'am," he said, voice quiet, "you're safe here. You're at Circle M. You can stay till you're strong enough to ride again." Ella studied him through weary eyes, the sun-tanned face, the dust on his boots, the strength in the way he filled the doorway. He looked like the land itself, hard, steady, unyielding. "I've nowhere to go," she said after a long pause. Her voice cracked on the last word. He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time you quit running." The simplicity of the words struck something deep in her. For weeks she had been running, from loss, from poverty, from the hollow sound of her own footsteps. She blinked back tears and whispered, "Thank you." Clay tipped his hat. "You rest now, Miss Grayson. I'll see to everything." Then he turned and stepped outside, boots thudding across the porch. Days passed. Alma fed her warm broth and soft biscuits, rubbed salve into her blistered feet, and talked while she worked. Stories about the ranch, about Mateo's temper and Buck's cooking, about the good rains 2 years back. Sometimes she laughed so heartily that Ella found herself laughing too, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. By the third day, color had returned to her cheeks. She sat by the window, watching the ranch hands move like ants across the corral, roping, hauling, shouting, all under that same blazing sun that had nearly killed her. Yet here it looked different. The land was still harsh, but alive. It belonged to people who knew how to meet its cruelty with grit and grace. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Clay came again. He leaned against the frame just like before, hat low over his brow. The golden light cut across his face, catching in the stubble along his jaw. "How you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Thanks to your people." "They're good folks," he replied. "Owe 'em more than I could ever pay." She hesitated. "And you? You saved my life." Clay looked past her toward the fading sky. Did what any decent man ought to do. He glanced back, met her eyes. Still, I'm glad I happened by when I did. Outside, coyotes began to sing across the ridge, wild, lonely voices rising against the wind. Inside, the lamp flickered, casting soft shadows on the red roof beams above. Ella lay back against the pillows, exhaustion pulling at her once more. For the first time since leaving Boston, she didn't feel afraid. The desert hadn't killed her. It had delivered her here, to a house with a red roof and a man who'd looked at her not with pity, but with something quieter, steadier. As she drifted toward sleep, she thought, maybe mercy is what happens when the world stops looking away. The night air outside the Circle M Ranch carried the smell of mesquite smoke and beef stew. Inside, the kitchen was warm and golden under the lamplight. Ella Grayson sat at the long pine table with Clay Mercer, Alma Reyes, and Mateo. The meal was simple: fresh bread, beans, and Buck Travers' stew. But to Ella, it tasted like forgiveness. Clay had asked her questions between quiet spoonfuls, his rough voice careful not to pry too deep. "Boston, huh?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "You come a long way to wind up in a patch of desert." She gave a small laugh that didn't quite hide the ache in it. "I came to Copper Creek for a teaching post. When the mine shut down, the school closed before I even hung my coat. The last thing the mayor told me was, 'We don't need letters to dig copper.'" Clay's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a damn shame. A woman shouldn't walk 100 miles just to be told she don't matter." Ella looked down at her hand, still thin and pink from healing. "I wasn't walking toward anything, Mr. Mercer. I was walking away, from losing my home, from debt, from being forgotten." He didn't reply for a moment. Then softly, "Well, looks like the desert had other plans." The next morning, the sun came up blazing and relentless. Clay found Ella out on the porch, sitting with a borrowed cup of coffee and Alma's shawl draped around her shoulders. Her hair, still tangled from sleep, shimmered auburn in the light. He stood by the post, hat in hand. "You ever think about teaching again?" She looked up, surprised. "Teaching? Here. I got 12 men on this ranch," he said, nodding toward the barns. "Good hands, hard workers, but half of them can't read a ledger or write their names straight. Makes it easy for slick traders to cheat them. I figure a man ought to read the contract he signs." Ella blinked, half smiling. "Teach cowboys. Cowboys, drifters, ranch hands, anyone who wants to learn. You teach them letters, I'll pay you fair." She almost laughed at the idea. "You think they'd sit still long enough?" He grinned, a slow, crooked grin that made his eyes soften. "Not at first, but you'll fix that, won't you, Miss Grayson?" It was the strangest offer she'd ever received, and the best. By the end of that week, the experiment began. Under the shade of a big cottonwood tree near the corrals, Ella stood before a makeshift blackboard, really just a sheet of slate tied to a fence post. She'd gathered a few broken chalks, old slates from Alma's storeroom, and 12 very uncomfortable men who looked like they'd rather be roping steers. "Good morning," she said brightly. A few muttered "ma'am" in return, eyes shifting to their boots. "Today," she continued, "we start with the alphabet. I know it seems simple, but so's tying your horse, and look how useful that turned out." That got a small laugh. The men relaxed. She wrote the letter A with slow, careful strokes. "This one's A, like apple, or Arizona." Finn Delgado, the youngest ranch hand, raised his hand shyly. "My mama always wanted me to learn to read. She said it makes a man free." Ella smiled, her heart catching. "Then we'll make her proud, Finn." The others watched as she guided him through the first few letters. Big, calloused fingers struggled to hold the chalk, but his grin was wide as sunrise when he managed to write his own name. By noon, sweat streaked every brow, and even the roughest cow hands were sounding out words like boys again. Alma brought lemonade and sandwiches, and the men teased each other good-naturedly over who could write straighter. Clay rode up partway through the lesson, stopping his horse in the shade. He didn't speak, just watched. The woman from Boston standing tall before a group of dusty ranchers, the sun glinting off her hair, her voice clear and steady as she called out letters. When she finally noticed him, he tipped his hat. "Looks like you found your classroom." "And my students," she replied, smiling. That evening, the ranch was quieter than usual. The men sat by the bunkhouse fire, practicing letters on scraps of paper, while Finn proudly showed Mateo the word horse he'd just written. Inside the big house, Alma hummed as she washed dishes, and Ella sat by the window, notebook open, planning tomorrow's lesson. Through the glass, she could see Clay crossing the yard, lantern swinging in his hand. He paused at the cottonwood, touching its bark as though marking the start of something. For the first time in months, Ella's laughter drifted across the yard. Light, genuine, free. The desert no longer felt like a punishment. By late autumn, the cottonwoods had turned gold along the creek beds, and word of Ella Grayson's lessons at the Circle M Ranch had spread farther than she ever imagined. Cowhands who'd once laughed at the idea of reading now carried scraps of paper in their pockets, practicing letters by lantern light. Ranchers from miles away began riding in, tipping their hats and asking questions. One morning, as the sun rose pink over the mesas, Silas Boone arrived on horseback, his hat pulled low, and his daughter Daisy riding behind him on a smaller mare. "Miss Grayson," he said, stepping down and offering a rough handshake. "My girl's sharp as a whip, but never had a school to go to. Think you'd teach her?" Before Ella could answer, another rider appeared. Amos Carter, his wagon piled with lumber. "Heard tell you're starting something worth believing in," he said. "Got a patch of land out by Cedar Springs. You can use it if you want." Then came Jed Calloway, the wiry old storekeeper who'd once told Ella there was no place for her in Copper Creek. He stood in the yard, twisting his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said gruffly, "I reckon I was wrong about this country not needing a teacher." It started with words, then plans, and before long, hammers and saws joined the chorus. Cedar Springs lay 10 miles east of the ranch, a quiet bend in the land where the water ran clear and steady all year. Clay had discovered it years ago, a place where the soil was soft and wildflowers grew thick after rain. Now it became the heart of something new. Clay offered the lumber, straight pine boards cut and hauled by his men. Silas Boone donated 2 teams of horses to haul the timber. The Carter family cleared the land. Alma Reyes and a few ranch wives began stitching curtains from flour sacks, while Buck Travers cooked for the crew that worked dawn to dusk. Ella, small among the men but fierce in purpose, became the spark that kept them moving. She drew plans on old ledger paper, measuring walls with twine and marking where the windows would face the morning sun. Each night, she sat at the ranch table by lamplight, writing lessons for children she hadn't even met yet. Clay watched her sometimes from the doorway, his face unreadable, but his chest tight with pride. She'd come into this land like a gust of spring wind, soft but unrelenting, changing everything in her path. The schoolhouse rose from the earth, one board at a time. By December, it stood whitewashed and proud against the horizon, a single-room building with a bell tower, a stone chimney, and a red door Clay insisted on painting himself. The first snow dusted the roof the day they finished. That night, the ranchers and their families gathered inside for a small celebration. Alma lit candles along the windowsills. Mateo played an old Spanish tune on his guitar. Laughter filled the little room that smelled of pine and sawdust. Ella stood near the front, one hand resting on the teacher's desk Clay had built from scrap oak. She looked around at the faces, men who'd once only spoken of cattle and fences, women who'd crossed deserts and lost children, boys and girls clutching slates in small nervous hands. "This isn't just a school," she said softly, her voice trembling but sure. "It's a beginning, out here where the land tests every man and woman. Learning is how we remember we're still human." Clay raised his glass. "To Miss Grayson and to Cedar Springs." The crowd cheered, and for a moment the desert didn't feel wild at all. The next morning the bell rang for the first time. Its clear tone carried over the valley, startling a few grazing cattle and echoing all the way back to Circle M. 11 children sat at rough-hewn desks. Daisy Boone, bright-eyed and curious, her brother Hank, pretending not to care, but sitting straighter when Ella called on him. Lila and Josie Carter, whispering behind folded hands, and several others, shy but eager. Ella moved through the room like sunlight, gentle, warm, but impossible to ignore. "Today," she said, "we begin with words. Words are doors, and once you can open them, the world can never shut you out again." As the children repeated their first letters, hesitant, shaky, but full of hope, the sound filled the air. Clay stood outside, listening through the open window. The voices rose and fell like music, the sound of something good taking root. He touched the doorframe, rough wood still cool from the morning air, and smiled to himself. Out here, in a land known for hardship, they had built something softer, something that might outlast them all. The first light of civilization flickered in the wild country that morning, and it carried the name Cedar Springs. The moon hung low over the Cedar Springs Valley, throwing silver light across the open range. The night was quiet except for the low hum of crickets and the steady whisper of wind through cottonwoods. Inside the small schoolhouse, Ella Grayson was grading papers by lamplight. The fire crackled low in the stove, and the scent of pine smoke clung to the air. She had just finished writing excellent work on Daisy Boone's arithmetic sheet when the sound of pounding hooves shattered the calm. A horse skidded to a stop outside, hooves kicking gravel. The door burst open and Toby Graves, the Boone family's messenger boy, stumbled in, his chest heaving. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Grayson," he gasped. "It's the Boones. Daisy's hurt bad. A hay bale fell on her in the loft. Mr. Boone sent me to fetch help." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Ella dropped her pencil and was already on her feet before her mind caught up. Clay Mercer, who'd been repairing a lantern near the hearth, set it down and stood. His face went still, his jaw tight. "Get water and clean towels," he told Alma, who had been mending curtains nearby. Then he turned to Toby. "You ride ahead and tell Silas we're coming fast. Go on now. Ride hard." Within minutes, Clay was out in the yard, saddling 2 horses beneath the cold stars. "You don't have to come," he told Ella, tightening Buckshot's reins. "Doc Weller's already been sent for." Ella threw on her shawl, eyes fierce. "She asked for me," she said simply. Clay paused, then gave a short nod. "All right then." They rode out together, the night swallowing them whole. The road to the Boone Ranch wound through rocky flats and dry creek beds. The moonlight turned the land into a pale sea of dust and shadow. The horses' hooves pounded in rhythm, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in Ella's ears. She clung to the saddle, shawl whipping behind her, the cold air biting her cheeks. The ride was rough, but her mind was steady. There was no room for fear. Not now. When they reached the Boone place, the yard was alive with noise. A lantern burned on the porch, and June Boone stood outside, her face pale and streaked with tears. "She's upstairs," she cried. "It's her head. She ain't waking up." Clay jumped from his horse, helping Ella down. They hurried inside, boots thudding on the floorboards. The house smelled of hay, kerosene, and panic. Upstairs, Daisy Boone lay on a narrow bed beneath the glow of a flickering lamp. Her golden hair was matted with blood, her face ghostly pale. The fallen hay bale had caught her off guard, striking her temple. She looked so small, so fragile, that Ella's breath caught in her throat. "Don't you go losing her," Silas muttered hoarsely, pacing at the foot of the bed. His hands were shaking. Ella pushed past the fear, her voice calm and steady. "We keep her warm. Talk to her. Don't let her drift away. Chumari." Clay found blankets while Ella pressed a cool cloth against the girl's forehead. The minutes stretched thin as wire. Outside, coyotes howled and the wind rattled the shutters, but inside that room, time stood still. "Come on, sweetheart," Ella whispered, brushing Daisy's hair back. "You hold on now. You're stronger than this." Clay sat beside the bed, his hand on the child's shoulder. His face was lined with worry, but his voice stayed firm. "You listen to your teacher, darling. She's got more sense than all of us put together." Hours passed like that, quiet talking, changing the compress, praying without words. The lamp burned low. Then as the first hint of dawn spilled across the horizon, Daisy stirred. Her lashes fluttered. "Mama," she whispered weakly. June let out a sob and fell to her knees beside the bed. "Oh, thank God," she cried, clutching her daughter's hand. Clay exhaled, shoulders slumping with relief. Ella sank back in the chair, tears blurring her vision. When Doc Weller finally arrived, he took one look at Daisy and nodded approvingly. "She'll be all right. You saved her, miss. Most folks would have panicked." Ella just shook her head. "She saved herself. I just stayed with her." The doctor smiled faintly. "That's the trick, isn't it? Staying when others run." Outside, the sun broke over the hills, turning the desert gold. Clay walked Ella back to the horses. The night's chill was giving way to warmth, but he could still feel it in his bones. "You were steady as a mountain back there," he said. "Didn't flinch once." Ella looked toward the sunrise. There wasn't time for fear. He studied her in the light, the smudges under her eyes, the stubborn lift of her chin, the quiet strength in every line of her face. "That girl will remember your voice for the rest of her life," he said softly. "So will I." For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them was silent except for the wind through the mesquite and the soft snort of the horses. Clay finally tipped his hat. "Let's head home, Miss Grayson." She smiled faintly. "Home," she repeated, tasting the word like a promise. And as they rode back through the morning light, the land seemed somehow less harsh, the sky a little wider, the world a touch kinder. The Boone girl healed slow but steady. By the time the wildflowers began to bloom again along Cedar Springs, Daisy Boone was back at her desk, head bandaged, smile bright as sunlight. That miracle carried farther than anyone expected. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Folks who used to call Ella Grayson, the lady from Boston, started calling her Miss Ella, spoken with respect, not distance. At church gatherings, she was no longer the stranger sitting in the back pew. When ranch wives baked pies for Sunday socials, her name was on every list. It wasn't pity, it was belonging. At dawn, Ella taught the children of Cedar Springs, 11 bright faces, from Daisy Boone's shy grin to little Lila Carter's quick wit. In the afternoons, she worked with ranch hands under the cottonwoods, her voice rising above the scrape of chalk on slate. Men who could ride a bronco or mend a fence blindfolded now sat cross-legged in the dirt, practicing their letters like schoolboys. "Say it out loud," she'd remind them, pointing to the chalkboard. "Contract," they'd echo, voices rough but proud. "Good," she'd say, "now spell it." At night, when the day cooled and the stars came out, she read aloud from a tattered Bible or a copy of the Pilgrim's Progress. Even the roughest cowhands leaned against fence posts, listening quietly. The words weren't just lessons, they were comfort. Out here, where loneliness could eat a man alive, Ella had built something that fed more than the mind. She found herself at the heart of every family and story. June Boone sent her jars of peach preserves. Alma Reyes asked her to be godmother to her youngest niece. Even old Jed Calloway, who still pretended he didn't have a sentimental bone in his body, built her a wooden bench for the school porch. And Clay Mercer, he was always near, steady as the land itself. He didn't hover, but he was there when she needed him, fixing a broken shutter before she even noticed it, bringing her coffee on cold mornings, or riding beside her on trips to collect supplies. Their conversations were easy, but beneath the surface, something warm and wordless had started to take root. But the days grew long, and the demands of her calling pressed heavy on her shoulders. There were papers to grade, letters to write, lessons to plan. When she wasn't teaching, she was sewing curtains, patching books, or visiting sick families. Some nights, she barely remembered to eat before collapsing into bed. One evening, Clay stopped by the schoolhouse to deliver new firewood. The sun had gone down, and lamplight spilled through the window in a golden square. Inside, Ella sat slumped over her desk, fast asleep, a pen still in her hand. Ink dotted her cheek, and half-graded papers were scattered around like fallen leaves. Clay set the firewood down quietly, then walked over. For a long moment, he just looked at her. This woman who had come to his desert and somehow turned it into something that felt alive again. "Ella," he said softly, touching her shoulder. She stirred, blinking herself awake. "Clay? What time is it?" "Late," he said. "You've been at this all day." She rubbed her eyes, smiling faintly. "There's just so much left to do." He chuckled under his breath. "You can't pour from an empty cup, Miss Ella. Even the Lord took a rest day." Her smile widened, tired but gentle. "And what would you have me do instead?" He tilted his head toward the window, where the stars were starting to climb the sky. "Take Sunday off. Ride with me. We'll follow the river out past the canyon. I'll show you a place the desert forgot." She hesitated, her sense of duty warring with something deeper. "Clay, the lessons. They'll wait," he said, voice low but firm. "You've earned a breath. Let me help you take it." For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The air between them hummed like summer lightning, quiet, charged, full of unspoken things. Finally, Ella nodded. "All right," she whispered. "Sunday then." When Clay left, she watched him from the window as he crossed the yard, lantern swinging at his side. He stopped once to glance back, tipping his hat before disappearing into the night. Ella turned back to her desk, but the papers no longer looked so heavy. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, a stillness, a warmth she couldn't quite name. She had come to this place searching for a purpose. She'd found something greater, family, and maybe, just maybe, something like love. Sunday came soft and golden, the kind of day the desert gives only a few times a year. The air was sweet with sage, and the faint perfume of wildflowers that had fought their way through rock and drought to bloom. Clay Mercer waited by the gate of Circle M Ranch, his horse saddled, the reins easy in his hand. When Ella Grayson stepped outside, the morning light caught her hair, making it shine like new copper. She wore a simple calico dress, her shawl tucked close against the breeze. Clay tipped his hat, a smile ghosting his lips. "Ready to see what's past the fences?" he asked. She nodded. "I've been looking past them since the day I got here." He grinned and they rode out side by side. The land opened before them, rolling hills of red earth, scattered cactus, and patches of yellow bloom stretching toward the horizon. They rode in comfortable silence for a long while, the rhythmic beat of hooves echoing through the stillness. Every so often, Clay would point out a ridge or a trail, telling stories of the ranch's early days, of broken horses and flash floods, of men who stayed and men who didn't. When they reached the rise overlooking Cedar Springs, Ella gasped softly. Below them lay a hidden valley, green and quiet, where a clear spring trickled between cottonwoods. Wildflowers swayed along its banks, painting the ground in gold and violet. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Clay dismounted and offered her a hand down. "Thought you might like it. Not many folks know this spot. The Apaches used to call it the place that breathes." She knelt by the water, touching the cool surface with her fingertips. "Feels alive," she said. "It is," he replied. "The spring runs all year. Even in the driest season, it don't give up." They spread a blanket beneath the cottonwoods. Alma Reyes had packed a picnic, fried chicken wrapped in paper, fresh bread, and apple pie that smelled of cinnamon. Clay poured coffee from a tin thermos and handed her a cup. The world around them was quiet but for the murmur of the water and the wind through the trees. For a long time they just ate and watched the clouds drift. Then Clay leaned back on his elbows, studying her. "I've seen a lot of folks come through this land, Ella," he said. "Most don't last. Some come for gold, some for land, some for what they think is freedom. But this country," he gestured toward the endless sky, "it don't make room easy. You've done more than last. You've changed it." She set her cup down, meeting his gaze. The warmth in his tone made her heart stumble. "I haven't changed anything, Clay. I just taught some children to read." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "You brought light to a place that forgot what it looked like." She wanted to look away but couldn't. The space between them felt heavy, not uncomfortable, just full, like the moment before rain breaks from a cloud. Clay took off his hat, setting it beside him. His voice dropped low, almost uncertain. "I've come to care for you, more than I ever thought I could." The words hit her harder than she expected. Her pulse quickened, her breath caught. "You mean that?" she whispered. He nodded, steady as always. "I'm not a man of fancy talk, Ella. Don't know much about poetry, but when I see you, standing in that schoolhouse, fighting for folks who've never had anyone fight for them, it does something to me. Makes me think this place ain't so lonely after all." The wind picked up, rustling through the grass. She could smell the clean scent of earth and water, feel the weight of the moment pressing close. Without meaning to, the words left her lips. "I love you, Clay Mercer." He blinked, startled, then smiled, soft as the horizon, certain as sunrise. "Then let's stop pretending we're just friends." He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing against hers, and the touch sent warmth flooding through her. She leaned closer, heart hammering in her chest. When his lips met hers, the world fell away. The ranch, the hardships, the loneliness, All of it melted into the hum of the wind and the whisper of the spring. For a moment, even the desert seemed to hold its breath. They sat side by side long after the sun dipped low, the sky washed in rose and amber. Ella rested her head against Clay's shoulder, the steady rise and fall of his breathing anchoring her to the moment. "Funny," she murmured. "I thought I came here to start over." He smiled, brushing his thumb over her hand. "Maybe you did, but you started something for all of us too." The coyotes sang in the distance, their calls drifting through the valley. Clay pulled her closer, his voice a whisper against her hair. "Welcome home, Miss Ella." And for the first time in her life, she believed it. Autumn came early to Cedar Springs that year. The hills turned gold, the air sharp with the scent of sage, and a light breeze carried dust like glitter over the valley. Word spread fast across the ranches. Clay Mercer and Ella Grayson were getting married. The news rolled through the land like a good rain. Cowboys rode in from as far as Bisbee and Fort Bowie, tipping their hats and polishing their boots. Wives baked pies, little girls braided wildflowers into their hair, and even the roughest ranch hands scrubbed their faces raw in the trough just to look respectable. By noon, wagons lined the ridge above Cedar Springs. The new schoolhouse, the one Ella had helped raise from nothing, had been swept clean and draped with white linens. The cottonwoods shimmered in the wind, their leaves turning silver and gold. Out front, a wooden arch had been built, wrapped in ribbons and sprigs of desert sage. Beneath it, Reverend Jed Calloway, in his best black coat, stood waiting with a Bible in his hands. And down the dirt path, riding side by side, came the bride and groom. Ella's dress wasn't fancy. Pale cream cotton, hand-sewn by Alma Reyes and trimmed with lace from an old curtain, but she glowed all the same. Her hair was pinned with wildflowers, her cheeks warm with color. The crowd turned quiet when she dismounted, helped down by Clay's steady hand. "Lord, she's pretty," whispered June Boone, dabbing at her eyes. Even Buck Travers, who rarely said a kind word about anyone, muttered, "Looks like an angel that's learned how to ride." Clay, in a clean black vest and polished boots, looked every inch the cowboy he'd always been, broad-shouldered, sun-worn, and just a little uncomfortable in front of so many people. But when he looked at Ella, the tension left his jaw, and he smiled that slow, sure smile that made her heart stumble. The Reverend lifted his hands. "We're gathered here under God's sky to join these two souls in marriage. No church roof needed. He can hear us just fine." Laughter rippled through the crowd. As the vows were spoken, a hush fell. The wind quieted, as if even the desert wanted to listen. "Do you, Clay Mercer, take this woman to be your wife?" Clay's voice was steady. "I do. Been doing it in my heart for a long time already." "And you, Ella Grayson, take this man?" Ella smiled through the tears shining in her eyes. "I do, with all that I am." The Reverend closed the Bible and nodded. "Then may the good Lord bless what's been built here." Clay reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring, polished till it caught the sunlight. As he slipped it onto her finger, his voice dropped low, meant only for her. "You walked 100 miles to find this place," he whispered. "Maybe the desert was leading you home." Ella's breath caught. "Home," she repeated softly, and for the first time, the word didn't feel borrowed. It felt hers. When the ceremony ended, the valley erupted with joy. The ranch hands fired pistols into the air. Children shouted and chased each other through the sagebrush. And Alma cried openly in the front row, waving a handkerchief. Buck Travers unveiled a feast big enough to feed half the territory. Roasted beef, fresh bread, corn pudding, and Alma's apple pies stacked high. Clay lifted Ella onto the dance floor, a patch of smooth dirt lit by hanging lanterns, and they swayed to the tune of Mateo's guitar. "Don't tell me you can't dance, Mr. Mercer," she teased. He chuckled, guiding her with a firm hand. "Not much to it. Just hold tight and don't let go." As the sun dipped below the mesas, the stars came out one by one. The laughter and music carried across the open land, mingling with the soft rustle of wind through the grass. Ella leaned her head against Clay's shoulder, eyes closed, heart full. The same land that had once nearly killed her now cradled her life's greatest joy. "Funny," she murmured, "how the desert tries to break you before it lets you belong." Clay kissed the top of her head. "Maybe that's how it knows who's strong enough to stay." They danced until the last song faded and the stars burned bright above Cedar Springs. Around them, the people of the valley, the families, the cowhands, the neighbors who'd once been strangers, laughed and toasted under the open sky. It wasn't just a wedding. It was proof that love could bloom in a land made of dust and bone. And as Clay held her close beneath the glow of lantern light, Ella knew she hadn't just found a husband. She'd found her home. Spring, 1892. The morning sun rose soft over Cedar Springs Valley, spilling gold across the hills and setting the cottonwoods aflame with light. A cool wind carried the scent of new grass and rain-soaked earth, a rare gift in the desert. On the porch of the Circle M Ranch, Ella Mercer stood with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching her husband and their little boy in the yard below. Clay Mercer had set up a wooden dummy calf near the corral, and their son, Jack, no more than 4, clutched a rope half his own height. Clay crouched beside him, showing him the loop, patient as always. "Swing it slow," Clay said. "Don't fight the wind. Let it work for you." Jack nodded solemnly and gave it his best shot. The rope spun once, twice, then dropped harmlessly in the dirt. The boy looked up, frustrated, but Clay just laughed, a deep, easy sound that rolled across the yard. "You'll get it next time, son," he said, setting the rope back in the boy's hands. "The trick's not in the throw, it's in keeping your aim true." Ella smiled, the kind of smile that came from a heart full and steady. The ranch had doubled in size since she'd first arrived. New barns, new cattle, new faces. But it wasn't the land she cherished most. It was what had grown beyond it. Down in the valley stood Cedar Springs Academy, gleaming white against the red hills. It had started as a one-room schoolhouse. Now it had a bell tower, a small library, and 2 assistant teachers who'd come from Tucson to help. 32 students filled the desks, ranchers' sons, miners' daughters, and a few children of drifters who'd decided to stay. Their laughter carried on the breeze some mornings all the way to the ranch. Hank Boone, the once reluctant boy who used to scowl at every lesson, now taught arithmetic to the younger children, his boots thudding heavy on the same wooden floors where he'd once dragged his feet. And Daisy Boone, the girl Ella had saved from the brink of death 5 years ago, was preparing to leave for the Territorial University in Tucson. When she'd come to say goodbye the week before, she'd hugged Ella so tight it had stolen her breath. "You're the reason I believe I can do this," Daisy had said. "You taught me that the desert gives back what you put into it." Those words had stayed with Ella every day since. The sound of hoofbeats drew her out of thought. She shaded her eyes and saw a lone rider approaching along the dirt road that cut through the sagebrush. The figure rode slow, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. As the rider drew closer, Ella saw it was a young woman, dusty, travel-worn, with a satchel of books slung over one shoulder. The woman dismounted stiffly, eyes wide as she took in the ranch house, the fields beyond, and the green valley stretching toward the horizon. She looked half-starved, half-hopeful. "Ma'am," she said, voice trembling with fatigue, "I heard there might be work for a teacher here." Ella's breath caught. The stranger's face was flushed from sun and wind, her boots cracked, her clothes threadbare. She looked achingly familiar, not in features, but in spirit. For a long moment, Ella saw herself 5 years earlier, stumbling through the desert, lost and desperate, clutching a teaching certificate that had almost become her burial paper. She smiled gently. "You came a long way to find this place, didn't you?" The young woman nodded. 100 miles, maybe more. Lost my job up north. Folks said there was a school here that might need help." Clay had come up behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Ella, a question in his eyes, but she was already moving toward the stranger. "Come in, Miss Vance," the girl said. "Clara Vance." Ella's smile deepened. "Well, Miss Vance, you found the right place. Let's get you some food and rest. Tomorrow we'll ride down to the schoolhouse." Clara's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "Thank you, ma'am." Ella reached out, squeezing her arm. "You can call me Ella." As the 3 of them walked toward the porch, the sun dipped lower, setting the valley aglow. Clay lifted Jack into his arms, the boy laughing as he reached for his mother's hair. The moment felt small and endless all at once. A circle completed, a new one beginning. Ella paused, looking out toward the hills where the desert met the sky. Once this land had nearly broken her. Now it held everything she loved. She turned to Clara, who was staring out across the valley with the same awe Ella once had. Out here, Ella said softly, hope and hardship grow side by side. But if you keep faith and keep moving, the desert will lead you home. And as the evening light turned the hills to gold, the sound of laughter and promise drifted across the land that had once been barren. In a place where thirst and hope shared the same ground, kindness had carved a home.